This is a special two-part episode featuring the Greater Little Mountain Coalition and Craig Rood on the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan draft. You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Muley Fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Corsi.
And welcome to Wild Things and Wild Places. I'm your host, or guide, as Shireen says, Joshua Corsi. Joining me today, I've got two special guests that I have, colleagues of mine that I've been working with for years now that span more than a decade, longer actually than the organizational effort of the Muley Fanatic Foundation, some conservation efforts that began during our tenure and time with the Mule Deer Foundation prior to establishing the Muley Fanatic Foundation, but on a specific cause, on an effort that has had a lot of engagement, has had a lot of folks come together, and these two folks joining me today, they've been there from the onset on this. And joining me today, I have Steve Martin, who is the past president of Bowhunters of Wyoming and active member and advisor to the organization still to this day. And also joining me today, I have Executive Director of the Wyoming Wildlife Federation, Joy Bannon. Welcome, Steve. Welcome, Joy.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Yeah, glad to have you both here. Of course, we're here to discuss an effort that has been a decade and a half of the making of the Resource Management Plan, the RMP, for the Rock Springs BLM Field Office. That's a mouthful in itself, but I think just for little bit of a background, why don't, Joy, you take this and just explain what an RMP is, just so we can get the terminology and the understanding of what we're talking about out of the gate, and then we'll get into the details and the meats and potatoes of what we're here to talk about.
I think to help, I'll just describe a little bit. So in the state of Wyoming, we have about 50%, a little bit more public land, and then about 50% private land. There's different managers, such as the Bureau of Management and Forest Service, United States Forest Service, as well as some parcels that are managed by the state of Wyoming. Today, we're talking about our Resource Management Plan, which managed by the Bureau of Land Management. In Wyoming, they have 10 different field districts, and those field districts make up several million acres each, and those field offices need to be guided on how to manage those acres. And that's essentially what a resource management plan is. They have a guide, this is the plan, that tells that agency and that field office how they want and need to manage those lands. And under the National Environmental Policy Act, of which these plans are guided by as well, they revise them about every 20 years, which is a large span of time, but it's a short period of time, considering how you view it. With that, we are under a revision currently within the Rock Springs Field Office, and that started back in 2010. Surprisingly, it's 2023 now. Usually, these processes go through different stages. They start with the beginning, where it's called a scoping process, where they just say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to revise this plan. Tell me what you think. Then they have a draft, of which is the stage we're in currently, where the Bureau of Land Management provides us with their preferred management plan or preferred alternative, and then they provide some other alternatives as well. And we can get into that a little bit later. And then after the draft, and there's public comment period in all of these stages, then they go to the final. People have another opportunity to comment. And since the draft to the final, there should be changes that the Bureau of Land Management makes based on the public comment they received, for example, during the draft, and then into the final. And then the fourth stage is record of decision, where they sign it. And that's a basic overview. But the resource management plan, it is a little bit wonky when you think about just understanding of what that means. And basically, the Bureau has to review, okay, what are all the resources? What are all the uses on this acreage? So things they include in the plan are going to look at energy, mineral, water, forests, wildlife, and the list goes on. And so it's a pretty long document. And again, we're in this draft stage of the revision. It's a great opportunity for public to get involved. And we're here to help guide that, or at least share in a bit more kind of layman way of what this policy kind of wonky label is.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that. But Joy, I think you've done a great job explaining this, what an RMP is. I think specific to the Rock Springs field office, a couple of points that I think I would like to make. The Rock Springs field office is a large field office, 3.6 million acres that are overseen by the BLM in southwestern Wyoming. Essentially, this particular management landscape of this area, it brackets the cities of Green River and Rock Springs, overlaps with portions of Fremont, Lincoln, Sublette, Sweetwater, and Uintah counties. It's a very large chunk of land. It's a landscape that is prized by various stakeholders. I think the other thing that I would like to maybe throw out there is that I think it's also fair to say that essentially an RMP as a land use plan is a zoning tool for a BLM management area, in this case, the Rock Springs field office. And I think when you can identify where development of activities to include oil and gas drilling are allowed, along with the rules that all users of public lands must abide by to protect sensitive fish and wildlife, water, recreational, other resources, that really sets the table for how important this is. And as you alluded to, we're currently seeing what is the playbook or the gospel for this landscape, 3.6 million acres, mind you. This was put in place and is operating out of a manual that is 26 years old today. It's 1997 that we're operating out of this playbook. And we've seen a lot of changes in 26 years on the landscape, not just in southwest Wyoming, but in Wyoming and other public lands, particularly when you look north of us. There's been a lot of changes on the landscape that are all operating out of these type of playbooks. And that's what makes, I think, the priority and so much of an interest for us to make sure that we have a voice in how this process plays out and to make sure that the interests of sportsmen and that they're carried forward. And so that's really what has brought us all together. Steve, I'm curious what your thoughts are. August 17th, just a few weeks ago, when this draft was released, shock and awe?
Absolutely. It was shocked to look at the preferred alternative that was shared with us on a Zoom meeting prior to it being released. But yeah, we go from one extreme to the other, I believe.
Yeah, I think initially, all of us from the sportsman community applauded the efforts of the BLM to recognize that the sportsman and sportswomen voice it didn't fall on deaf ears. There was definitely some garnered attention to making sure that there were protections in place for the things that we do in conservation for wildlife across the board. But I think as we got to digest that, we got to look at it a little closer. We got to see the scope and how encompassing this field office is and the varying landscapes within this field office. I think it all started to resonate a little bit with each of us. I would say that we've done a good job. We've done good diligence in the last decade and a half of bringing all stakeholders that this impacts together so that we could work and understand what their priorities were, where our differences were, and how we could reach a compromise or a balance. And I can't think of a better word than when you talk about multiple use of management, which is the charge of our Bureau of Land Management of these landscapes. Striking a balance is a challenge, and it's difficult. But I think the Wyoming way of doing that, I think we did a good job in bringing these people together for all of us to have a seat at the table and talk these out. And so I think that's where we're at today. We've got several alternatives in front of us. The preferred, which is alternative B, as was promoted by the BLM. And then we got A, which essentially does nothing, leaves it the way it is. And then we've got C and we've got D. When you look at all four of them, Joy, I think probably none of them are a match or a fit to our proposed alternative that we put forth, but I think D probably closely aligns with that, but there's still some things in there, to use your word, are a little wonky.
Yeah. And I just to share a little bit more, when you describe that we brought a lot of the stakeholders together, that was specifically for the Greater Little Mountain area. And that was a collaborative effort, which is the Wyoming way. And it took a long time for all of our leaders and all of those different stakeholders to come to a lasting, we thought, a good management proposal that could have lasting positives for the land. And you're right, the BLM did acknowledge some of that, and some of that is within Alternative D, but it's not black and white, that is for sure. There are components of our management plan that exist in Alternative D, and there's some that don't exist anywhere in any of the four alternatives, and there's some that are peppered in a couple of others. And so it won't be straightforward. And in some regard, absolutely, the BLM listened to that collaborative effort, incorporated those items. But I think when we move from, we're at the draft now, having some public comment to guide the Bureau of Land Management toward a final management plan, a final preferred alternative within the Greater Little Mountain area that really matches the coalition and the effort that we as Greater Little Mountain Area group really worked hard to attain and then move forward.
Yeah, that said, Joy, I think the one thing that's important to note, just for a little background and some education for those that may have not been following this as intimately as our coalition has. And again, this coalition, the Greater Little Mountain Coalition, made up of several sportsmen's groups as well as the Steelworkers Union. It's been a long process. But that Greater Little Mountain Area landscape, it represents about 522,000 acres. It's about 15% of the entire Rock Springs field office of the 3.6 million acres. It's in comparison, it's a very small portion of the entire landscape. But it is a landscape that has been coined as the gem of Sweetwater County. I've even heard it referred to as the Yellowstone of Sweetwater County. It is a very prized landscape for recreational opportunities, hunting, fishing, camping, stargazing, bird watching, you name it. This is the crown jewel of the county in that regard. And within that landscape, it was not, hey, we want to protect this entire thing. It was never that from the onset with this group. Again, we wanted to understand what some of the other intentions were of other stakeholders that operate and have activity within this landscape. But there were some areas, and when I mention areas, I'm specifically talking about Sage Creek, Currant Creek, Sugarloaf Basin, Red Creek, that eastern portion of the Flaming Gorge Reservoir. That was where we really wanted to make sure that we need some serious effort into this landscape, recognizing that other areas in Pine Mountain, Salt Wells, that there would be some activity, but if it could be done responsibly, we could get on board and we could say, green light, let's move in this direction where we could all make a little bit of a compromise, recognizing that there was still this impetus of protect what we know cannot afford to have that type of impact for development. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is.
Go ahead, Steve.
I agree wholeheartedly. And there is, to me, it seems like there's a misconception that when we talk about the Greater Little Mountain Coalition, that we're talking about just Little Mountain. But there are other landscapes out there around Little Mountain that we feel need to be protected. But like you say, it was a collaboration of all stakeholders that looked at what encompassed the boundaries of the Greater Little Mountain area, and then those 6 priority areas that we separated and then talked about what they could allow and what they could not allow, or what shouldn't be allowed in those areas. And that was something that we all collaborated on, and something that we feel very confident about.
Yeah, and when you say collaboration, Steve, I think it's important to note that in doing our homework and trying to make sure that we could dot all the I's and cross all the T's, that we had to have everybody at the table. Even determining what we would identify as the Greater Little Mountain area to be south of the checkerboard. We had conversations with Rock Springs Grazing Association. But when we got to the point of where we were able to put it on a map and identify, this is what we are talking about when we say the Greater Little Mountain area. Being able to get the cities of Rock Springs and Green River, both municipalities, getting the Sweetwater County Commission, and we've now had several changes within that commission over 15 years, including a current commission that 4 of the 5 have never even been a part of some of these conversations just because of the way the turnover works within political leadership. But I think if there's a feather to put in the cap of the coalition, it was that we didn't leave any stone unturned where we weren't reaching out to make sure that we had buy-in for folks that had an ability to influence moving this needle forward. And yeah, I applaud those efforts, but I do have some concerns, and I think we all do, and I think everyone shares that this is a very important time frame, that it requires great engagement now more than ever. We have a comment period that is out until November 16th. There's a public meeting that's being held at the Rock Springs field office on September 27th from 3 to 6. And this is, like no other country in the world has, This is, in my mind, the synonymous effort of acting on the very word of freedom. This is your opportunity as an American citizen on American lands to have your voice be heard for how this landscape will be managed potentially for the next 2.5, 3 decades.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to just real quick, Steve, just to piggyback on something that you had said relative to the coming together and identifying what we wanted in that proposal as a coalition and talking with the various stakeholders, because we didn't leave any stone unturned. And we did talk to all of the different folks who, from the ranching to the mineral extraction folks, because they're part of the coalition as well. And we sat down and there was areas, as Joshua, you said, within the Sugarloaf Basin, Sage Creek area, Current Creek, that we wanted a little bit more, let's not see surface development on there. And because of the sensitivities of the soil, because of the high value biologically and productivity of that landscape for vegetation and wildlife and those values that we hold, but then also having some reasonable and compromise as collaboratives are in the salt wells range on the eastern portion of this area, this 522,000 acres, where, that area we said, okay, let's remove some protections. So for, say, example, the big game winter timing stipulations so that energy has the opportunity to go in there. And that was something that was discussed so that it was we are very reasonable in our management proposal. And that was put together because of those conversations and the known idea that there are places that we really want to protect, but we're also knowing that there's other uses that need to do their business as well.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we all still live here, we work here, and I think Joy, and I think you've said it well, but I think when you do make those compromises or you do try to understand some of those other interests of the landscape and the benefits that it provides to its particular user, that's how you find balance. And you do that through conversation, you do that through credible actions, you do that through building relationships. And I think that's what's caused a little bit of pause right now for a lot of folks, and rightfully so, that maybe what is seen as this overreach of DC, maybe it's not that. And maybe we shouldn't look at it like that. Maybe we should really focus on the efforts of what this process looks like. And the process is very important. And the process does require engagement. And that's a very important part of this. The BLM will evaluate and respond to the coalition's proposal during this planning process, along with other information that's provided by the public and other stakeholders. Members of the public who support the coalition's proposal, they should communicate their support to the BLM during this public comment period of the draft Rock Springs RMP. But engagement is the key here. It is absolutely essential that folks, and the timing, let's face it, as sportsmen's groups, it's hunting season, it's football season. There's a lot of distractions right now, but this is about prioritizing this to elevate it to a level of action, to be involved and make your voice heard.
Agreed. And I would say, too, that it can't be understated that it is important for the American people to comment to the BLM on this particular plan. In some ways, it's like, how do we do that? You can say, oh, I like the Big Sandy area, or, oh, I like Sugarloaf Basin. What is a comment to the BLM that will be impactful to them to be able to maybe make some changes for the better from the from the draft where we're at now to the final or the next stage? And when we look at this large resource management plan with the different prescriptions that they put in, the different alternatives, how do we navigate that large document? And certainly everybody has the opportunity to review that document, but if to aid the American people, there are different opportunities through nonprofit organizations, through the Greater Little Mountain Coalition. We've been talking about that, so we can continue there as an example. But there's a website, and then there will be the availability for folks to review different. So we will have talking points available that will aid the folks to say, okay, this is what they have analyzed from the document. This is what they say is a potential comment to come up with a final management plan that we also would agree with. And that's an avenue to go down. I think another one that's also important is you could just say, these are areas that I really have been recreating in. Be as specific as you can to the agency so that they know what you're talking about and which value that you would really like to see for that area. And that helps. As specific as you can be, it will aid the BLM in their development of this plan.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. And when you talk about recreate, I think it's important to note that recreate does not just necessarily entail hunting and fishing. Recreate involves camping, mountain biking, hiking, side-by-side ATV use, photography. It's everything under the sun when you talk about outdoor recreation. And when you talk about the Greater Little Mountain's valuable multiple-use landscape, which it is, and it's second to none in my mind, this is also not an issue that just is important for Wyoming, but this is public lands. And I think that that's important to note, that these lands, everybody that is an American has a vested interest in these landscapes, whether they live here and are stewards because they're in their backyard and have an intimate relationship with this landscape, or they live in South Carolina, Florida, Ohio, wherever, but they come here and they enjoy these lands. These lands belong to all Americans, and I think it's an American responsibility and a civic responsibility to be engaged to this process.
And as you said, Josh, it's our freedom to be able to participate in this process. And I just want to remind everybody that to go into this, to look at these alternatives with an open mind. It's not all about what we, being selfish, need to look at. We need to look at it from all aspects and look at the economic development possibilities for our county, because if we don't have that, we don't have the ability to get out there. So do we need to strike that compromise that we can all live with and still be able to protect the things that we love?
Yeah, and Steve, on that note, of course, we're talking about such a small segment, 15% of this entire field office. Of the entire field office, the 3.6 million acres, those opportunities, and a lot of those opportunities still exist today. There's 1.8 million acres that are existing leases for development within this field office that are not developed. It has no impact to them. For lack of a better way of saying it, they're grandfathered in from a prior arrangement, a prior contract, a prior commitment. So there is development that can still occur. But what is important for folks to really understand the significance and the severity of this is we could be looking potentially all the way out past 2050 before this process begins again. I don't know that I'll be here in 2050. I don't know that. I mean, I would hope to be, but I never know.
Children, our grandchildren, it's those generations that this is a very important document because it spans so many decades and so much time. And just to add, when Josh, you noted the development piece in the 1.8 million acres, that's specific to oil and gas.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. And there's other developments. You look at wind, you look at solar, and there are other things coming that have varying opinions on and concerns. And all of that puts a scar on the landscape at any level. I know there are folks out there that just think green energy is the way to go. And, you don't get those wind turbines and solar panels in without building infrastructure for that. That includes roads. That includes other impacts to the landscape, just like when you have oil and gas. And we are an energy, I think that is healthy for our nation to be energy independent. And I recognize that we need it. I recognize that it's a very valuable component. And that's why we're not opposing this entire field office. We've just carved out one special place within this, 15% of this landscape that says we need that, but we also need this. We also need to have those places where we can go and let our souls be free on a landscape that's not developed, that is pristine, that does have a beautiful resource of natural wildlife from deer, elk, pronghorn, moose, sage grouse, trout. I mean, that's why we live in Wyoming. That is,
Absolutely.
When you really think about Wyoming, Yellowstone, as much publicity as our first national park in the American National Park System gets, Yellowstone, the landscape is pristine, it's beautiful, and that's preservation. That's not conservation. That's different. But if you remove the wildlife, there's only so much interest in seeing geysers, in my opinion.
But it is down to balance, coming back to that. And ultimately, it's a quality of life. In Wyoming, we have a lot of rich natural resources, and that includes all of the things we've discussed today, from the energy component to the wildlife to the vegetation in the water. And so when it comes to those pieces, that quality of life is critical to our way of life too, right? We want that. And thus it's also putting that into our economic portfolio as the state, as the BLM manage these lands. So it's that combination of different uses, the combination of how we manage those lands and what's used on those lands, and the wildlife, and that conservation component is critical as well. And that has a value in that quality of life. I wanted to mention one more thing as well that's different from these 2 to 3 decades of time that go by. As what was mentioned earlier, the Rock Springs Resource Management Area, or the Rock Springs Field Office, is currently being guided by a plan that was written in 19, and now we're going through this revision. And from back then to now, we have different science. As that area of study and research occurs, new information, new data, new things come to light that then are different, or ways for us to help guide how we manage these acres. So the science also changes, and that's another reason why it's important that these revisions occur, so we can have all the updated information to guide correctly in the best of our ways. But that's just another element to this whole story and picture, is that as time goes by, things change, and that needs to be adapted to such and incorporated. And so it's a very large swath of different things that are a component of this plan, but they're all each individually important. And we're just glad that we can participate, and that we have had time and the energy and the kind of focus to bring different stakeholders together to really come up with hopefully a lasting plan. And you're right, Josh, and Steve, this preferred alternative that is currently out, there's been a lot of negative comments from various stakeholders and decision makers and whatnot because of what that looks like. But again, that public engagement to provide public comment on what they want and what the management they would like to see into the future. That's why this time is so important.
Really, again, I know we've stressed it, and I'll continue to stress it until we put November 16th in the rearview mirror. This is the opportunity where the public engagement process, consultation with local officials, fish and wildlife agencies, other key stakeholders, this is it. That window of opportunity is now, and I know there are folks that when certain organizational efforts they have paid staff to be able to weigh in. Our county commission will weigh in. Municipalities are weighing in. Our game and fish will weigh in. Cooperators certainly will have their thoughts on this. But the general public, who doesn't necessarily represent an organization or a body of people, the general public's voice cannot be missed on this opportunity. It has to be heard. It has to be said. And it does. As you mentioned, Steve, it encompasses everything under the sun, including ag, including development, including the opportunities to be able to take your side-by-side and be in the middle of nowhere. All of those things are part of this. And when you say you can review the document, boy, you better grab a bottle of Chivas, because it is a document. It is nearly 1,500 pages, and it's dry as can be. Don't read it before you go to bed, because you'll be asleep in 5 minutes.
I would say that going to the maps first, which is in the first volume.
Everybody loves
really
visuals.
Helps. Yes, it tells its own story. So just to start getting oriented with it, if you go down that road to just say, yep, I'm going to open this up, I'm going to start reading it, I recommend going there as a first step, just to really orient yourself and get an understanding from that visual aid.
Yeah. All right. As we wrap up again, just want to bring some light and significance to what this process has and what it entails and how important it is for people to weigh in. Closing thoughts, Steve?
Well, like I said, if you look at that document, it can be pretty overwhelming. But reading through that, like Joy said, look at the maps, pick out the areas that you're most concerned with, and then find those in tables that are above the maps. And that will basically line out everything that is required or not allowed in those areas, and make your comments, because that's what's going to lead us into the future, and it's going to be the document that's going to lead the Rock Springs Field Office in guiding the Rock Springs Field Office for protecting those lands or not protecting those lands for our children, our grandchildren.
Yeah, I would say the other piece is, and it has been mentioned once, but there are those public meetings coming up. There are 3 scheduled at the moment. One is going to be in Lyman, one will be in Rock Springs, and the other one in Big Piney. And so that's another opportunity to just talk with the agency, talk with the BLM. There'll be various employees there with their expertise, field of expertise to discuss and talk with. And it's also, I think, important as the American people, as a even Wyoming community, to show attendance at these meetings so that the BLM really knows we do care and we are watching, and we do want these lands to be managed in a way that does include, of course, they are abided by the multiple use, but in a way that we see fit here in Wyoming and in America.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely essential. And Joy, you touched on, we talk so much about the one meeting because it's close proximity at the Rock Springs Field Office, which again is Wednesday, September 27th from 3 to 6. But there are 2 additional meetings. One the day before, September 26th. That is a Tuesday. That'll be at the Big Piney Marbleton Town Hall. That'll also be from 3 to 6. But the first one, which is September 19th, and that'll be from 3 to 6 at the Lyman Branch Library. And that just gives you more than anything to know that there's these other meetings beyond the Rock Springs Field Office headquarters, these other communities, Big Piney and Lyman, that really shows you how encompassing this landscape is. And I think that's an important piece for folks to realize is our specific effort, again, with the Little Mountain area, it's 15% of this field office. It's a very small, carved-out chunk of land, southwest Wyoming that borders Utah. But these other landscapes within this field office, they're under the same revision. It's all part of this draft as well. And I think that just really stresses the significance of how big and the impact that this process has. And I think we've said process a whole bunch of times, but that's where we're at right now. And we've been working on this for a decade and a half to get to this process. And now it's time to step up. And if you're in need of more information, I would certainly encourage you to reach out to any member of the coalition. You can reach out to Wyoming Wildlife Federation, Bowhunters of Wyoming, Muley Fanatic Foundation. All of us have been invested into this process for a very long time, and it's a very important process. I thank you both for taking the time to help get this word out. I do think that this is a very serious effort that requires attention, and it requires a little inconvenience. But I think it's an effort that is worth taking, and I look forward to seeing how this all shakes out. I would like to tell you right now that when all this is said and done, we're going to circle the wagons and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it, because there's going to be a lot of details there. Nobody's going to get everything they wanted, for sure. But I know as a representative of sportsmen and sportswomen, all of us in our efforts are going to be to make sure that we try to strike that balance, to make sure that those special places are there for special memories to be made for years to come and generations that have yet to even be born yet.
Thank you for having us and for emphasizing and talking about this very important resource management plan for Rock Springs Field Office.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate both of you. Thank you very much. Good to be in the arena with you.
Thanks for putting it together, Josh.
All right, that was my guest today, Steve Martin and Joy Bannon. Steve, of course, with Bowhunters of Wyoming, and Joy Bannon with Wyoming Wildlife Federation, part of the Greater Little Mountain Coalition, and talking about the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan and its draft process that is underway right now, and the importance for you as the American public to be involved in this process, to have a say, to have your voice be heard on how these public lands, your land, as Woody Guthrie would say, these lands are your lands, and to have a say and a voice in how these lands are managed for the next 20, potentially 30 years. Thank you very much. Wild Things and Wild Places, if you like, please hit the subscribe button. New episodes every Tuesday. Been talking a lot about the Rock Springs RMP of late, and joining me today, Craig Rood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you here. And this topic, so much of this topic, folks want to steal headlines and talk about the impacts to oil and gas or maybe conservation, wildlife. But there's a lot of other resources in southwest Wyoming that this RMP impacts. And I couldn't think of a better expert, if you will, to talk about your background, your field of study, where you've built a career. You've dedicated your life to this industry, and For a lot of folks that maybe aren't even aware that are listening to this from afar, if you live here, you know what Trona is. But if you live in Northern California, you might not know what Trona is. So maybe we should start there with a background on Trona.
Right. So Trona is one of those chemicals that everybody uses every day and doesn't really know about it. And Southwest Wyoming is home to the biggest Trona reserves in the world, bar none.
The world. Yeah.
And in fact, it's the only big reserve in the world. So there's a couple of small reserves in Turkey, which my company actually has mines at, and then a little bit in China, but virtually the rest of the Trona is in Southwest Wyoming. And its main use is glass. So every piece of glass in America has Trona in from Southwest Wyoming.
Whether it's your home, your business, your automobile, you name it. If there's glass, there's Trona.
Exactly. Everything from specialty glass like microscopes, binocular scopes, to big soda ash, which is refined Trona in the manufacturing of glass.
So when this RMP draft came out on August 17th, Trona industry certainly was full attention.
Yeah, definitely. I think the one thing that even people in Southwest Wyoming don't realize is the traditional Trona mines are in reserves that are mechanically mineable, which means you take big equipment underground and remove the Trona with that equipment. Now, the biggest part of the reserve is south of Green River and has to be mined with in situ mining or solution mining, where you pump water down, dissolve the Trona, and pump the Trona liquid up, leaving all the mud and insoluble materials underground. And that's where the vast majority of the reserves are. This RMP plan has a big impact on that area, as well as much of Sweetwater County.
Yeah, much of Sweetwater County. Big field office again, the Rock Springs field office, 3.6 million acres. We've put a lot of attention and a lot of effort into 15% of that field office, 522,000 acres in an area that has been coined the gem of Sweetwater County, the greater Little Mountain area. But I think even the groups and the stakeholders that have been involved in this process for the last decade and a half, wanting to see some protections for the Little Mountain area, I think all of us, I could say, at least with the coalition, very surprised by how what appears to be a very overreaching effort to just lock down a lot of landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being a Wyoming native and having lived here my whole life, I absolutely want to protect the land, but we can do that responsibly, and we've proven that with 60 years of mining in the area. And it's not just Trona mines, there's coal mines, there's green energy in the area. They're working on a nuclear plant up in Kimmer, which is in a different field office, but similar technology will be around forever. So I think it can be done responsibly and without the overreach and without shutting down so much of Sweetwater County. If you look at that preferred plan, it just shuts down thousands of miles of two tracks that we're used to using to get out and enjoy the county and our great area that we have here.
I think the important thing that what's timely about our discussion is that there's an opportunity, and that opportunity is for the public to engage in this opportunity of being able to provide comments, give feedback. There are 3 meetings that are scheduled, one beginning next Tuesday, the 19th. That'll be taking place in Big Piney. Then there's a meeting on the 26th in Lyman. And then I think probably what should be a standing room only meeting, the 27th in Rock Springs at the BLM field office. And the role of the public to weigh in on this, extremely important.
Yeah, it's important, and I don't think we can emphasize that enough. It's time to get involved, especially sportsmen and outdoor enthusiasts and longtime residents of Sweetwater County, because if the preferred suggested, the B permit?
Yeah, the alternative B.
The alternative B goes through, that will have an impact on anyone who recreates in Sweetwater County. And I think it's not enough to just attend the meeting. You got to be willing to voice your opinion in a productive way, because just showing up with 500 people won't do anything if only 2 people talk, because it'll be the same 2 people that always talk. So it's important you go there and voice your opinion in a productive way that we can come to a good conclusion for everybody.
Yeah, and to take that one step further, I mean, attending the meeting, yes, that's important. But as Craig, you alluded to, submitting written comments. The Rock Springs field office, they're don't want to call them the middleman, but it's the collection point for locals to have a representative from the BLM. But ultimately, in this very important process, that feedback has got to get back to D.C., where the decision makers are making these determinations.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. The Rock Springs field office is a middleman. Most of them are Wyoming people. They understand the area. They understand what we do. And I work with them on a daily basis, and they understand. And there's, that feedback does got to get to DC and help them understand our way of life here, and that we are interested in conserving the environment just in our way.
Yeah, striking a balance, right? Yeah. Manage for multiple use. There's no better way to describe that than having a balance. And that takes a little compromise, and it comes through understanding of what needs of varying stakeholders are. But when you first seen Alternative B directly impacted to your industry, the Trona industry, what was so alarming to you about it?
I think even more than my industry, I worry about Sweetwater County, because if you look in there, they tell you it will have an economic impact on the county, and it's a big impact. And I worry about that in our way of life here. If they're telling you it's that big of impact, it's likely going to be more than that. That was the first thing that struck me, is just what all is this going to affect? We've got some new businesses in Sweetwater County, and you hate to see things like this that could potentially drive them out of business.
Yeah, said. Specific to the Trona industry and the permitting that the Trona industry, there are several Trona mines. It's not just yours. There's a couple of others.
Right. 4 current Trona mines that have been in the area for 60 to 70 years. My company is permitting a new Trona mine south of Green River that will be a solution mine. Specifically, there's areas in there that are called out as wilderness study areas, a little bit to the west of us. And then a lot of shutdown of roads that we were going to use for the right-of-way and right-of-way areas. Huge impact on our project is a $3 billion project. It definitely is scary when you start thinking about things that could shut that down when we've got a lot of money invested already.
Yeah, is it safe to say, Craig, that Trona is the lifeline of Sweetwater County?
Absolutely.
Hands down, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's important to the state economy, too. It doesn't have the impact that coal or oil and gas does, but it still contributes about $40 million a year to the state economy with the whole industry. So it's important to our state, and it's steady. It's not like the others that have boom and bust. It's been a good, steady partner in the state for...
Yeah, and enough reserves to continue for another 60 to 70.
Oh, absolutely.
And 10 times more.
Probably about 300 years left at current demands.
Really?
But if you look at, and not to get into Trona too much, but if you look at the world demand, a lot of it's made synthetically in China with a lot bigger carbon footprint and no regard for the environment. And any pound of soda ash we make in Wyoming displaces that and is easier on the environment because the natural soda ash uses less energy. Obviously, we have better pollution controls here in the United States, and it offsets that so much and is good for our whole world.
You don't tend to think when you talk about Trona and mining in a mineral industry like that, you don't tend to think of Trona as an industry that has a crosshair on it because you don't see it, because it's not on the surface, it's below the ground. Doesn't seem to resonate with folks that it has an impact because it is so much of the underground mining, but it employs and is truly the lifeline of our county.
Yeah, it really is. The industry right now has about 5,000 direct employees. We're looking to add another 400. There's another project that's going to add another 400. And then if you look at all the businesses that are tied to supporting the Trona industry, it's the majority of the county.
You look at the enrollment in schools and how many, you start connecting that 6 degree of separation of where people are placed and what other jobs people have that are associated, who somebody works within their household to the Trona industry. It encompasses a very large percentage of the entire corner of the state.
Yeah, and they're high-quality jobs. Anyone who lives in Sweetwater County knows we have a microeconomy here because of these jobs. And if you drive up and down the streets of Sweetwater County, it's very obvious that these are good jobs. People make a good living. They put their kids through college and have a great life with these jobs.
Yeah, you work hard and then you want to play hard. And Being able to have that balance and having places in your backyard that you can go to and find great wildlife resources, that's important for every Trona miner.
Yeah, it really is. And everybody who lives in Sweetwater County understands the value of the Little Mountain area and what a great resource it is here in southwest Wyoming. They're coveted tags to go out there and hunt, and everybody's proud of that area and wants to maintain it.
On that note, Craig, have you had a limited quota tag out there?
I have. I've been lucky enough I've had 5 elk in my lifetime.
Oh my goodness. You're that guy.
And 2 deer. So
everybody knows that guy. I can now say I know that guy. Yeah. They truly are. For some folks, they're once in a lifetime tags.
They really are. And they're especially fun. Early on, my son, and when he first started hunting, we had one out there, and it's just a special hunt when you don't got to hike to the top of Wyoming Peak to shoot an elk and shoot a good quality elk.
And a good quality elk, yeah. Your observation, I know you're a sportsman. You and I are former neighbors before I moved. I know that you enjoy your time in the field. You look forward to the fall. Have you had much time to get ready for this year?
Honestly, I haven't. With this new project going on, I've been really busy, so not a lot of time this year. Me and my brother have a cabin up in Big Sandy Opening, so I've been spending a little time up there, but not a lot of focus on hunting this year.
Yeah, I imagine with your schedule and some of the other responsibilities you have, of which you and I will see each other in October, both on the BLM Resource Advisory Council, having a meeting in Rawlins next month. Speaking of that process, they haven't had a Resource Advisory Council meeting in 7 years. What are your hopes coming out of this that you hope to gain or hope to influence?
Yeah, it's an interesting. My term's about expired, and we've never had a meeting. But I hope that they're really open to productive work sessions and listening to the people that are on the committee. I think if you look at the group that's on the Wyoming committee, it's a good cross-section of Wyoming. And I think there's a lot of input there and a lot of value that can come out of that group if they're willing to listen and escalate it up through the right channels so that it does get heard in D.C.
Yeah, I'll be frank with you. I don't mind saying this. I'd say it to the director. I'd say it to the BLM director. I have some reservations that this might just be a box that has to be checked. When I see the history of this committee and the lack of organized effort to organize and to gather this input, and then there's a part of me that feels like, I guess we got to do this.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I do. I have some of those reservations too, but I guess trying to be optimistic. I think if it wasn't an exercise in that, they probably would have had one before they released the RMP just to get that input. One more. It's a pretty good screening when you fill out that application. So I think they're trying to select good people. You think they'd want to use all of the knowledge within that group.
Tap into that resource, huh?
Yeah.
Speaking of the resource management plan and the draft, there's 4 essential alternatives. The easiest way to describe this: Alternative A does nothing. It pretty much leaves things the way they are, as status quo. Do you see some changes, though, that are needed from the way this landscape is being managed now, which is now 26 years in the making from the same playbook of the 97 revision?
I think we need to protect some of the land. I think overall it's been managed pretty well, but I think with the impact of a growing population and just changes in, if you look at things like 10 years ago, we didn't have everybody driving side-by-sides around the country.
That's changed a bunch.
There's a lot of things that have changed technology-wise that have changed how we have to manage the land. And I think there is some things that we need to do. We need to, it's great to be able to use those to access areas, but it's also not good to access areas that you shouldn't be accessing. And I think we need to do some things to manage that better. Again, that alternative B is just over the top, far reaching.
Yeah. Alternative B, again, many of the lands within the landscape or the field office of Rock Springs Field Office, 3.6 million acres. Many of those lands are put into what are being determined as ACEC, or Areas of Critical Environment Concern. And of course, that fancy acronym also means a lot of stipulations and a lot of restriction. And I think on the surface, that's what has got so many people up in arms about this, is that you just see an impact to your way of life. And that's far different than the impact that we started our conversation with, because the economy here, we don't have a state income tax. Our mineral and extraction industry is a viable component to what makes a state tick.
Yeah, and I think anybody who's spent any time in Sweetwater County and in Wyoming has seen that wildlife and industry can coexist. You go out near a well field that's wrapped up and is just pumping now, you'll see antelope there, you'll see deer there, you'll see elk there. A lot of the mitigation that's been done to clean up afterwards, you've got sage-grouse populating those areas and coming back to areas that they weren't even at. I think we've proven in Wyoming, and I can't speak for other states, that industry and wildlife can coexist, and we can manage the land in multi-use.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. When you talk about balance and you talk about being able to come together, industry funds a lot of wildlife conservation.
Absolutely. And, we started a group here in Sweetwater County. I was at one of the traditional Trona mines for 30 years, and I helped, the plant managers got together, and we started a group to help with sage-grouse because we saw what was coming and is still coming at us with them being listed, even though we have a good, healthy population here in Wyoming. And we started a group, and it took years and lots of dollars and lots of lawyers, and we put together a program to help manage sage-grouse around and do conservation for the sage-grouse, and it's been very successful.
Yeah, and many of those efforts, what's good for the bird is good for the herd. I mean,
exactly.
When you start doing one thing that's good for wildlife, many species of the wildlife populations benefit from that.
Yeah, I think, again, I'll go back, and I'm very familiar with Wyoming, but we do a lot, especially in Sweetwater County, and I travel around the state a lot and work, and people are impressed with some of the efforts we have in Sweetwater County to get stuff done, and we do got a good group of people here who can get things done when we do, and I think this sage-grouse conservation that we did was a good example of that. We didn't have to do that.
Yeah. What about organizing a group to help mule deer?
Yeah, I think we've got a good example of that sitting right in front of me.
Well, maybe we need another one. Mule deer, gosh, they've taken it on the chin, have they not?
Man, they really have. And this winter was just brutal. I go back and forth to Cheyenne a lot, and I-80 was just, I couldn't believe the animals living on I-80 because that was the only place there wasn't snow.
No other refuge, huh?
Yeah.
And the carcass carnage that just piled up in certain areas, it was just prolific.
Yeah, they took it hard this year, and I hope they rebound quicker than they probably will, but I'm optimistic. My son's been spending some time up in the mountains, and he said he's seen more deer than he thought he would.
Oh, that's a good sign because other reports are pretty bleak. Yeah, it's obvious that there's a fraction of the population left from what we went into last winter with. But one thing that makes Wyoming unique when you talk about decision makers, an arena that I've seen you at many times, I know you're with your past occupation as the plant manager, you had a vested interest in being engaged to our citizen legislature every year during the session. That is a quality of Wyoming that I also think is very unique. Our citizen legislature represents every corner of the state with everyday blue-collar people that truly care about moving Wyoming forward responsibly. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. And I think most people don't realize that. I know until I started spending a lot of time in Cheyenne, I didn't realize it. And I didn't realize how accessible everyone is. And they do want to move Wyoming forward responsibly, but people have to reach out to them because I think maybe someone who's not that involved expects that legislators will reach out to them if they need something. But I mean, that's not the case. They're very busy people, but they will take your call and they will listen to you. And and they'll work with you. Even if it's not something they agree with, they'll work with you. And I've seen multiple examples of that. And it's very unique. You're right. It's a citizen legislature that is actually still engaged with the citizens.
Yeah, and that is certainly, I don't know the inner workings of every other state in the union, but I know it's something I'm very proud of in our state that these folks are very approachable. Many of them will give you their phone number, their cell phone number. Many of them you'll see in the grocery store and they'll stop what they're doing to have a discussion with you. But it does take that initial step forward to be involved and to say, hey, I've got some concerns, and to have someone give you the time and listen to you and try to understand your perspective, maybe explain a different one that you haven't thought of. But the engagement part is a civic responsibility of all of us.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's why it's so important that everybody gets involved in this issue that's going on and attends those meetings. And even if you're not comfortable speaking up, write a public comment, send it in. You don't necessarily need to attend the meeting to be heard.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because, again, I wanted to mention this earlier and I forgot, but I don't think everyone understands that what we think is public land here in Wyoming is the checkerboard, and I'm not sure everybody understands the checkerboard of every other section's private and BLM, and this Alternative B is going to shut down a lot of what we take for granted of just heading out on our side-by-side or going for a drive or going fishing and crossing land that we think of as all public, when in reality it's not.
Yeah, said. Yeah, because that's something I believe wholeheartedly that is taken for granted in this part of the state. When you look at that and how that checkerboard goes on both sides of the interstate, north and south, you just think of that as public land because there is no restriction of access. But that could change.
Yeah,
and it could change overnight.
And people from other states know that. I know when my son moved home back to Wyoming from Montana, first trip out to Aspen Mountain, he was like looking at his onix and saying, "We're on private land." And I was like, that isn't really how it works here. Yeah. But he was nervous about it because in Montana, you don't do that.
Yeah. And I've had countless experiences very similar to that with a non-resident that has been in this area hunting, reaching out for guidance, doing the same thing, looking at his phone at an onX apps and saying, looks like I'm on Anadarko property, or it looks like I'm on Rock Springs grazing property. Checkerboard's different, but it's very magical.
Yeah, it really is. And it's part of the mineral industry here in Sweetwater County. That's why it was originally established, was the Union Pacific got all the mineral rights under every other section. So
that's enormous.
Yeah,
a lot of history there. Yeah, as far as the process and being engaged, you're absolutely right. If you can't attend the meeting, and I know that takes some planning and some time with schedules at 3 o'clock in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, it's not easy for everybody to participate, but there is a way for everyone to participate, and that is online through the BLM website.
Yeah, and public comments, I believe, are open until November 16th. So plenty of time to get comments in. Sometimes if you've got a group that you're involved in, it carries more power than if your personal letter, but personal letters work great too. I know as an industry, we're going to send in comments from the Wyoming Mining Association, the Wyoming Business Alliance, several other organizations that I'm involved with are going to send in public comments as a group, and what an impact it'll have on not only this southwest side of the state, but also the state of Wyoming.
And you're right. It's across the board in the impact that it'll have. If it was, as presented, was to reach a record of decision with Alternative B as the go-ahead, things would look far different in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, there's a lot of great recreation areas in Sweetwater County that would be affected.
Yeah, and I firmly believe that we can have a thriving oil and gas industry. We can have a thriving Trona industry. We can have a thriving wind and solar, green energy industry. I mean, we can strike the balance and have wildlife at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And like I mentioned earlier, we've proven that, and we'll continue to do that here in Wyoming.
Yeah, that's a Wyoming way.
Yep, absolutely.
Craig, I appreciate your time. Anything you want to close on? Anything that you've been thinking about that you want to make sure we could cover?
I guess I expected to see more uproar on social media, so I hope everybody's paying attention. I hope everybody shows up, and I hope everybody gets involved. You got a voice. Like you said earlier, it's your civic duty. Use it. Let them know what you're thinking.
Yeah, on that note, I can't follow up with anything other than that because I think that's the message. Everybody's busy. It's hunting season. It's football season. There's Go Pokes. They're doing great. There's a lot of excitement about things that you could classify as just good distractions. But when you look at the long term and the impact that this will have, again, this current resource management plan that we're operating out of, or the playbook, the gospel for how these lands are managed, it's 26 years old. And so when this new one becomes a record of decision and is implemented, it could exceed any of us that you and I, 30 years from now, we may not even be here. I mean, that's how big this impact is to children that will enjoy that landscape that aren't even born yet.
Yeah, and I've got a brand new 1-year-old grandson that I want to enjoy what I enjoyed growing up, and this will change if it goes through as presented right now.
Yeah, get involved. That's the message. That's the takeaway here today. Get involved, make your voice heard, get involved with groups that are going to be involved in this process to make sure that they can carry your message forward, and that's the process, and that's how we can provoke change and bring it back to Wyoming the right way. Yeah. All right. Craig, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today on Wild Things and Wild Places, and We'll cross trails in the meantime. Happy trails to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley Fanatic.